Good Thursday afternoon, everybody. Welcome back down to my library. And today's video, I'm finally going to wrap up Novella November. Now, Novella November was a reading event that I personally came up with. It was a month where I read nothing but short books, hence the title, Novella November. So I read 13 books, which I gotta say, the most I ever read in a month this year. So I have a variety of physical books, Kindle books, and Audible books. Without making this video way too long, I say let's get started. And the first book I read, which was more of like a short story, this is only like 29 pages or so. This is part of the Creature Feature collection. That story is Best of Luck by Jason Mott. And this was an interesting story that was about like a man who was down on his luck, and some creature fed on his good luck, forcing him to have bad luck. So that was a pretty solid story, and I rated that one 5 stars. And I do have to say, I have a lot of 5 stars on this list. But that was the first book I read. And the second book I read was Below by Laurel Hightower. And this was another solid one. I actually gave this 5 stars as well. And this is about a woman who gets stranded during a snowstorm, and her car breaks down. There is only one suspicious man on the road to help her, but she doesn't trust him. So she goes on this journey to find out if what she's seeing is real or fake. So when this goes near the end, she ends up in like a cave, and she figures out that the man that helped her has been dead the whole time. And you also have like this Mothman creature. It was a really creepy book, and it had a very good twist. And I really did enjoy this one quite a bit. It was one of my favorite reads from November. It's literally only 106 pages. But that was Below by Laurel Hightower. The next one I read was actually my longest book on this list, but it was part of my anthology prompt. That next book is Satan Rides Your Daughter, One Hellish Anthology. And book of short stories, a lot of them were really decent, but the one that really stood out to me was Charity Begins at Home, which is a Christmas slasher. And I believe this rich family invites random people into their home, and then they kill them, and this family lives forever. It was a very solid story. Another one that was pretty decent was the Stonehenge Street Haunt. That was basically about a teenager who worked at a haunted house attraction, and this woman like said a curse on him and it ruined his life. But that was another decent one. But I also rated that 5 stars. And that was on Audible. The next one I read was actually a break from the horror. I read Rockers and Rollers, a full throttle memoir by Brian Johnson of AC/DC. Now, this is pretty much about Brian Johnson's car collection more than anything. Unfortunately, it really has nothing to do with AC/DC whatsoever. But he did put out another memoir more about AC/DC that I want to check out at some time. I think it's called My Life or something. I'll put it down here. But I just found this to be kind of So I rated that 3 stars. The next one I read was probably one of the most disturbing books that I read this month. And it was very extreme. No One Rides for Free by Judith Sonnet. And this was on Audible. This was the story about a mom and her 2 college-age kids on a road trip. And this random man decides to go into their car when they stop at a gas station. And this story gets messed up and very twisted. Trigger warnings galore. Incest, necrophilia, graphic violence, graphic, and I mean graphic, sexual material. This one was a little much for me, but I really did enjoy it, and I would say that this is in the top 5 of what I read in November. So I don't really want to go into much detail because it goes dark. It's really messed up. But that was No One Rides for Free. The next one I read was The Farm by Matt Shaw. And I found this one to be just okay. But it was another extreme horror. And this was essentially about a man who lost his wife to like a kidnapping, and this crazy dude from like Great Britain, it's like a 2-way POV, because you get one storyline in Great Britain and the other storyline in West Virginia. So this man abducts women and he keeps them at his home, but once they die, he strings them up as scarecrows. To me, I found this story to be kind of forgettable, but that was The Farm by Matt Shaw. The next one was another Kindle read, Chopping Spree by Angela Sylvain. And I found this one to be very entertaining. It starts off as a slasher, but it gets very cult-like in the middle. Okay. But this is the story of a group of teenagers who work at this very upscale mall, and there is a man loose in the mall, killing people. So they fight back to try and kill him. But it turns out the teenagers are part of the Court of Plutus, I think it was called. And they worship the god Plutus, which is like the god of wealth. Very weird turnaround, but I really did enjoy the story quite a bit, and it has an explosive ending. But essentially, the final girl needed to be part of this cult to survive. But she was the only survivor to get out of the mall, and the killer, which was like a wolf man in a way, he also survived. But you felt sympathetic for this guy because this cult murdered his daughter and wife, I believe. But it was a pretty wacky story. Speaking of wacky, the next one is Spakenstein by Tim Miller. Another extreme horror. Yeah, I read quite a bit of that this last month. But this one was about like this very nervous, shut-in guy who is 100 pounds soaking wet, but he is obsessed with like this actress, and he starts abducting women and murdering them and building the perfect woman for him. So it's basically Frankenstein, but with an extreme horror twist. This book was messed up too. You can definitely tell by the cover. It's very bloody and very brutal. But I really did enjoy it quite a bit. I also read another one by Tim Miller called Bloodbath, which was another very good one. But that was about like a female serial killer who abducts men and kills them and bathes in their blood. So that was a pretty messed up one too. So these two are definitely 5-star reads. I really enjoyed both of them, but I kind of did enjoy Bloodbath more. But moving on, the next physical book. Yes, I did read physical books this month. Elevation by Stephen King. And this is only like 146 pages. Yep. And this was literally about like a man who starts losing weight rapidly, and he befriends lesbian neighbors by him, and they try to help him with his deterioration. This was okay, but it was a little bit better than I thought. But it's basically a modern spin on Thinner, because this man just keeps losing weight and then he just floats up into the sky. But I did rate this 4 stars. It was a little bit better than I thought it would be. So that was just another Stephen King entry before the end of the year. But speaking of Stephen King, I'm going to show you what I'm going to be reading in December. The Drawing of the Three, and this is Dark Tower number 2. So I'm finally going to be able to start this tonight. It's like 461 pages, but I'm hoping to knock this out by the end of the year. It's quite a task, but I do want to squeeze in one more Stephen King novel for the year. But that is what I'm going to be reading from Stephen King next. And the next book I read in November was Savage Skies by Nicholas Sansbury Smith. And this was kind of like a break from the extreme horror, because God knows I read quite a bit of that. But this is a sci-fi novella. And this was essentially about a group of people in space, sci-fi, that are unaware that they were part of a cloning program, and there's like AI after them, but they don't know that they're clones. It was a very decent story, but I kind of thought it was forgettable. There we go. But that was Savage Skies. The next book I listened to, Savage Skies was also on Audible. But moving on, the next book was An Extreme Turkey Dinner by C. Commissar. This was also on Audible. This was a Thanksgiving extreme horror novella. And this is about a woman who wants the perfect Thanksgiving, but she suffers from schizophrenia. And she lost her son like a few years ago, and she's still grieving over that. So she invites her whole family over for Thanksgiving. Turns out she becomes a psychopath. This was a very fun Thanksgiving novella, and I really did enjoy this one as well, but I gave it 4 stars. Moving on, the next and final book I read on my Kindle was Triptych: 3 Tales of Frontier Horror by Richard Beauchamp. And this covered 2 prompts: Western horror and anthology. I really did enjoy all these stories very much, but I think the one that stands out the most is Blood Gulch. And that was the story of this outlaw named Maylene. And she went throughout the whole frontier while being plagued by some worm creatures. So she had to find her husband before he became one with the worms. It was a very solid story that got very gross. But the other 2 were very decent too. I just don't remember them that much, but that one was the best one. And finally, the last book I read throughout November, but I finished last night. And yes, I'm counting it. Gone to See the Riverman by Christopher Triana. And this was the last extreme horror book that I read. but it was the only extreme horror book that I read physically, and this was a very disturbing book. So it's basically about like this woman who falls in love with a sadistic serial killer, but the only way to get to him is to go see the Riverman, which is this demonic entity that grants your wish if you find him. So she is successful in her journey, but I gotta say, the way this thing ended, it really fucked me up. It had like a Pet Cemetery vibe to it, but essentially she wasn't left alive. But there are more disturbing things about this book that really stuck with me. Lori was our main character, and she has always been jealous of her older sister named Abby. Well, she snaps one day and she lets Abby fall off a cliff, causing her to become permanently disabled because Abby stole her love interest from her. But Lori decided to get with her own brother and forced him to have sex with her. And I'm like, what am I reading? But this really didn't go all out on the gore, but it was more of like a psychological extreme horror. And I do believe that this was my favorite book of November. And I think it's going to be in my top 10 best books of the year. This book is going to stay with me for a very long time. And by the grace of the Dark One, Christopher Triana recently came out with the sequel called Along the River of Flesh that I do want to read at some part, because I really did enjoy this story quite a bit, and I want to know what else goes on. But that was Gone to See the Riverman, and I also rated it 5 stars. And those are the 13 books that I read in November. Hope you guys enjoyed, and I want my next video to possibly be my top 10 Christmas horror films, and I will also do a review on Wonka, but that'll come like next week. So just winding down to the end of the year, and video ideas are still in my head, but I gotta start thinking of like my best of series, best books, and best movies. So those videos will come like near the end of the month. But other than that, that's all I got for this video. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Adios. Peace.